In fact, you might think I'm crazy for thinking that the very fate of the AFL depends on it, but AFLW really does represent the future. And I'm about to tell you how, in a few months.
Okay, hear me out. The success of the AFLW will decide the future of the sport, but first, let's look back on how we got here, or more accurately, how we didn't. Before we begin, a couple of things. Firstly, this video and its second part are going to contain a lot of references to women's rights, feminism, religion, and LGBT rights, as well as mentions of these unsavoury topics. These are issues that are intrinsically linked to women's footy, and I recognise that they can be touchy subjects. If that ain't your bag, this one's not for you. Also, I'd love to give a shout out to a few books that really helped this research in particular. Raw, The Stories Behind AFLW by Sam Lane, Women Don't Play Football by Chloe Dalton, and Play On, The Hidden History of Women's Football by Rob Hess and Brunette Lankage. Fantastic reads, check them out, because women's football is really important. After all, women's football in this country is older than all of these current AFL clubs. The first attempt to form a women's team was in 1880, with reports of all women's groups having kicked to kicks in 1886. Of course, as this was a time where it was not just accepted but a matter of policy and religious doctrine to diminish the contributions and roles of women, there is an alleged case of a woman being arrested and charged with being a public nuisance for kicking a football in 1892. Luckily, she got off because she'd only kicked it back to the others who were actually playing with it. Those in the court joked that if women did play the game, they'd ring her up gladly. How oddly progressive, and yet not. However, our glorious sport was very probably the first to actively be marketed to women. James Thompson, remember him? Well, he knew the value of also marketing the game to women to increase viewership and popularity. He stressed in this Argus article that women would have a comfortable and safe place to watch the game. In fact, women got so comfortable that the same newspaper would, in the same year as this arrest, complain that women were too passionate, reporting that women were spitting at players and attacking them with large pins. In fact, a rather wordy article written in the Daily Telegraph in 1886 sheds some light on the female fans of the time and the perception of them. The article impresses that many women are already fans of the game and don't shy away from watching tough contests, even the young, soft-hearted ones. The article then goes into weird territory, writing a poem about a middle-class mother of one of the Carlton lads, and then establishing very weird sentiments about the Jewish people, and claiming that some ladies are only there to be ogled. Just look at what they're wearing. Okay, the horniness and mild patronising sexism and the very possible anti-Semitism aside, the point was that people, and especially women, of all varieties came to watch football for all varieties of reasons, and it became extremely acceptable for women to attend matches in a time where they had limited civil liberties. The men were more than happy to have the women there, boosting gate receipts and swooning at their incredible manliness, but God help them if they actually wanted to play. The only recorded instance of women even remotely playing a women's-only game was a report in a Williamstown paper in 1886, with women having been recorded as wanting to play around that time, if not earlier. The way into football for women at the time was somewhat bizarre. Costume football matches, which rose to popularity in the 1870s, were a mix of typical sport and pantomime theatre, and much like black boxers in America having their only avenue into the sport be through the half-sport, half-farce of Battle Royale, costume football was the only acceptable way for those without balls to kick one. In some places it was really popular. An 1887 match in Ballarat drew 6,000 people, a mark the AFL has failed to hit surprisingly often in recent years at much bigger venues.
The biggest such match, in 1894 actually, according to the Argus, packed out the East Melbourne ground and featured several notable actresses of the time. The place that women first got seen playing football is now home to a bunch of posh hotels, a park with too many birds, and a railway line that is about to have a train coming through. Yeah, the 705 doesn't come through here much anymore. There should be a shrine here, not a goddamn train. Good, that train's gone. Anyway, what I said earlier wasn't strictly true. Most of the women in these matches were actually men dressed up as women, playing feminine characters that dressed into sexist stereotypes. Yes, arrest those women for playing football too well. We hate that because women are supposed to be feminine, men are supposed to be masculine. That's why we dress up as women and... Wait, what was our point again?
You see, around this time, women had only just begun to get extremely basic rights, and a lot of people weren't happy about that. Predictable. They set about making straw men or straw women to beat down. Should women vote? Should women swim? Should we allow them to smoke? What if that turns them communist? Bloody hell, they'll be making us do the housework next, lads. So, women becoming stronger, more independent, and thus less typically feminine by way of playing any sort of sport, even lawn bowls, was seen as a shocking social development, and as one 1885 paper noted, perhaps a threat to the typically all-male nobles. And look, there are female CEOs now, but sadly Jazz Garner hasn't become the modern-day Maximilian Robespierre, thanks to the 3 people that got that.
But a lot of women loved football, so much so that in 1900 Collingwood built a grandstand here at Victoria Park specifically for their large female fan base. A third of their members were women. Now, I'm going to focus almost exclusively on the on-field aspect of women's football in this video. That's my remit here. There's a lot better and more complete projects that have done off-field and cultural contributions as a whole. I recommend Football's Forgotten Women by Carolyn Brown and Kevin Sheedy, Up Where Kazali by Leonie Sandercock, and In the Outer, Not in the Outer by Deborah Hindley. They're all hundreds of pages of staggeringly detailed research that I can't hope to justify here without delaying this series for another year. But early in the days of women's suffrage, it's informative to study how women were treated as barrackers and non-players. Collingwood were not the only club to offer women-only stands, but if footy clubs were expecting them to be sheltered, sought by delicate suffragettes, clutching at their pearls whilst witnessing hard tackles, or shielding themselves from the rain with dainty pink umbrellas, they had another thing coming. Multiple instances were recorded of women stabbing or otherwise attacking opposition players and umpires with their umbrellas or hat pins as they withdrew from the field, and newspapers were somewhat obsessed with reporting bad language used specifically by female supporters. It's telling that the newsworthiness of 1 or 2 loud women was considered far higher than the general rowdiness of the hundreds of men in the same building. Rob Hess certainly thinks so in More Than a Game, and reports that a couple of decades later, newspapers were lamenting the fact that a lot of women weren't coming to games anymore. I wonder why. Women's interest in the sport was, as I touched on earlier, largely written off as either attending to show themselves off or being so entranced by 36 men in tight little shorts, a narrative which peaked when Hayden Bunton was playing and stuck around all the way until...
36 big guys in very tight shorts. Yeah, I'd like to see that.
You say the AFL didn't really care about women? No way. Anyway, 82 years before that fucking atrocity of a line, the VFL cared even less. South Melbourne had an episode where they wouldn't let Geelong's female members enter the ground for free, which the male members could. And of course, women's football wasn't even on the level of an amusing novelty. It was a scandal, a scary sign of a changing status quo that could only lead to a socialist dystopia run by chain-smoking alcoholic women built like W.G. Grace. So, while the men got their own league and got paid to run around on grand fields like this one with tens of thousands of people inspired to want to be like them, women's football wasn't allowed to be real. They were forced to wear silly costumes alongside male leading actors like it was a fucking Christmas pantomime, with humiliation levelled at any girl who showed an ounce of tangible skill. It would take something huge to turn these farces into the real thing. And, as it turned out, a radicalised young assassin was preparing to completely inadvertently usher in a golden age in the first wave of feminism with just a single pipe bomb.
World War I offered a brand new Wait, hang on, no. Why are we playing Blood on the Rises? What? No, I want... Play that upbeat war song. Oh, it's a lovely war! Yeah, there you go. Anyway, World War I offered a brand new paradigm for women. While their men were off being manly and protecting Australia by getting slaughtered by a German machine gun in a French bog because an Austrian Duke copped a lethal dose of Serbian dynamite, the womenfolk had to find their own way to help Australia get through the Great War.
So, for the first real time in history, they found employment en masse in all sorts of areas, mainly those deemed not suitable or too girly for the menfolk. However, applications dried up after 1915 when Australia lost its major battles in Tobruk and Gallipoli. Billy Hughes added fuel to the fire by attempting twice to introduce conscription, the mandatory recruiting into the army of civilian personnel, which was decided by public vote. Women were encouraged to take part, and Hughes campaigned to them, and although I'm against the concept personally, in this case it may have further empowered women as more men left to fight and die. Luckily, the jingoistic, imperialist, cock-sucking propaganda of the conscription campaign was overcome by more measured voices from the other side. Oh dear. Sometimes being on the right side of history means you're also on the wrong side of it. See how complex this stuff gets? The public yearned for distractions from the grim news of thousands of pawns being sacrificed to move foreign trenches forward an inch, and without enough men to field fun football teams to watch, women were more than happy, for the first time, to take their place. And this time, it was real women, not men playing pretend. A department store in Western Australia, keen for their female employees to find freedom outside of the workplace in a startlingly forward-thinking attitude for the time, began a football club. Foy and Gibsons made history in hosting the first organised women's team. Formed in either 1915 or 1917, they began playing publicised matches in the latter year to help raise funds for the war effort. This was a watershed moment as the success of the enterprise led other states to consider, for the first time, actively letting women play football. These matches quickly took the guise of wartime fundraisers, and as a result of their patriotic nature, support for these games grew significantly. But there were, obviously, detractors. Football at the time was seen as rough and violent. It was uncommon but not super rare to see reports of hideous injury and even death during matches. This was during a time in which the suffragette movement, ostensibly the first real wave of feminism, had only just begun to take hold, with male-led society pushing back hard to maintain control over women and of society at large. Even my favourite old-time footballer Dave McNamara was guilty of casual opposition to the uprising suffragette movement. Women were not allowed to vote, divorce, or even have control over purchases or bank accounts in most places at the time. So women playing a men's game? Well, that was basically an insult to staunch gender traditionalists whose idea of a lady was Mrs. Darcy, not Luke Darcy. Thought that one was pretty good. In Perth in particular, women's football could also be seen as a way of shaming men into joining the war. This was the only state in favour of conscription, so thus women being more butch by playing football than men who didn't want to wear a German machine gun brain piercing for king and country was, according to one historian, seen as a way to shame those men. That being said, the WA matches bred innovation. In 1917, women playing in the Goldfields League became the first recorded players in nearly 30 years to play under lights, and only the fifth recorded example of such. The first time a VFL game was played under lights for premiership points was in 1985. That's how forward-thinking they were. Matches were springing up all over the show, thanks to the opportunity for a fundraiser, and some men were in support. Geraldine Howlett played a match in 1917, raising money for the Parkerville Children's Home. She wrote to her boyfriend, Edward Rice, about it. Rice, serving overseas, gave her support that was, in a way, ahead of its time, saying he would have all but embarrassed himself screaming in support on the sidelines if he'd been there. We stan a true ally. Howlett went on to play several further matches, raising money for other funds along the way and becoming a trailblazer for women's footy in the state, teaming up with famed Foy and Gibson player Eileen O'Connor, who was perhaps the best player in the Proto League, and promoter Harry Bone, who was eager to draw as much attention to the spectacle as he could. He even landed Ivo Krapp, the first truly legendary umpire, despite his name, to officiate some matches. Krapp was particularly handy as his reputation gave an air of legitimacy to the whole affair.
Not every game was this unproblematic. A 1916 game that was organised here at the University Oval in Adelaide was indeed organised by a woman, which is great news. bad news, though, it was costume, and some of those costumes made those GWS players look like kids at Halloween. Despite the racism typical of the time, men and women actually played alongside each other. A match in Gawler the next year contained none of the frivolity, and whilst there was jeering to start, the louts were soon won over by a fine display of skill. Hell, footy games with women became so big, the damn governor was involved in a match in 1918 at the WWII Oval. The match featured support from two SA NFL teams, North and South, while all around workplaces were forming teams to play almost as a form of advertisement. At one match between teams representing Charles Moore and Company and James Marshall and Company, 3,000 people turned out to watch. Where was this match held, you ask? Oh, only the Adelaide freaking Oval, and all around the country the women's footy bug was spreading. At this time, games were recorded in Broken Hill and Queensland, even if the press coverage of both of those events was, in the main, and let's not beat around the bush here, completely and utterly sexist. As for Victoria, so-called home of footy, well, nothing was happening.
The first women's football match played in Victoria wasn't until 1918, and it wasn't even in Melbourne. The Lucas Company, a textile and clothing manufacturer based in Ballarat, hosted the Khaki Girls, a South Melbourne-based side representing the Commonwealth Clothing Factory. Funds from the match played at the Eastern Oval would go towards this, the Arch of Victory. The Khaki Girls, with a travelling party of over 100, got into Ballarat at 9 in the morning. They hopped off their train and were met with a guard of honour down the Avenue of Honour, having done a demonstration march through the streets. The game was huge. In 1921, the population of Ballarat was around 21,000. 6,000, over a quarter of Ballarat's population, turned up to the Eastern Oval to watch this match. Charlie Climo, former Saint and future Geelong Premiership coach, coached the local Lucas team to victory 24-8 in what was reported as a quick game of high quality. £330 was raised for the Arch's construction, about 12.5% of its total cost to build. The girls had a great time, so much so that they went to the VFL to arrange a fixture in Melbourne, a return fixture, to bring the Lucas girls to Melbourne. The VFL was initially receptive, but without warning, cancelled their involvement. As the war began to end, as men returned to reclaim their jobs, women were no longer required to turn the wheel of industry at home, to raise funds for an army that was becoming slowly unnecessary, and thus to play football. The Khaki Girls never got their return match, and sadly there's no evidence that they ever even played a single game against anyone, ever again. But for one afternoon, they took a town by storm. They helped build something great that stood for 100 years and will stand for 100 more. That's what women's football can do. That's why it's so important.
There were games played in Melbourne shortly after the Ballarat game, but again, the footy capital of Australia needed an outsider to kickstart it. Trixie West was a footballer, but not that type of footballer. A native Brit, she'd come over to Australia from a kingdom united in support for women's sports. Blythe's Spartans had just won the first women's soccer tournament in England in front of 22,000 people. West was disappointed to arrive in a nation where women's ball sports were pretty much unheard of and indeed actively discouraged unless they were raising money for the big men to fight. She was a trailblazer, and a feisty one. Over in England, women wore shorts to play. In Australia, it was seen as highly controversial, a woman showing her knees indeed, which shocked West. Regardless, she and others managed to get footy clubs to loan women playing gear so they could start playing the game themselves.
St Kilda supplied jerseys to a side that played under the St Kilda name in 1921, thus becoming the first VFL-affiliated team to play, and according to some reports, the first proper match between women in Melbourne at all. Not much is known about this team, known as Fleetwood, but they regularly trained at Junction Oval on Saturday mornings, then presumably stayed to watch the men's team get stomped into mulch. Just kidding. I'm not kidding actually, but you know, you were crap that season, but I love you, Sainters. They played a team called Chorley, another English name, thank you Trixie, who were kitted in Richmond gear. This was all part of a larger festival, and apparently the umpire did the second half in a dress, which, progressive, but obviously they did it for the wrong reasons. Melbourne women's footy was still well behind its Western contemporaries in that sense and a lot of others.
Also, Big Dave was there, and hopefully he'd gotten over the whole militant suffragist thing by that point. The next year, Fitzroy sent a women's team to Perth, where they played in front of 13,500 people, or, as GWS calls it, a capacity crowd. Love you too, Giants. Richmond in 1923 had a unique way of marketing their women's side that they'd adopted. They posted a photo of the team with masks over their faces. They were scheduled to face the men's reserve side, and when they played, they took those masks off and mauled that men's team. Sure, the men's side was in fancy dress, and the match was to raise money for an end-of-season lads trip, but the women took it seriously. They won 9-14 to 0 in the first win for a women's side over any men's side in Australian rules history. It just had to be Richmond, didn't it?
Whilst these clubs were beginning official affiliations with women's clubs, an SA NFL club joined the fun, Port Adelaide. The biggest club at the time in SA and maybe even the nation draped the already iconic prison bars over female players as well. I call it the Yatala Fit in 1918. This was also for a fundraiser, this time to build this, the Port Adelaide Workers' Memorial. Port played a team called Theberton and even had their players named in the paper, with Eileen Reid being the first female captain of an SA football side. The match was played at Port's home ground in Alberton, and Port got absolutely belted 50-6. Unfortunately, aside from that, very little seems to exist of the venturers. Unfortunately, Port didn't allow it to last for any longer than strictly necessary. The biggest peak came at the Adelaide Oval in 1929, right before the Great Depression came around to sit everyone back down on their asses. In peak 1920s hubristic excess, a freaking biplane dropped the ball onto the field to start the match, with 41,700 people in attendance for the 30-minute game. For reference, the Power have failed to hit that mark at home at this very venue against these teams across their entire existence.
And then the momentum stopped. It's hard to know exactly why, but two events are theorised to have a large impact on this. The first is the English FA's decision to ban women's footballers from using their venues, effectively reducing their audience from levels that rivaled or sometimes outstripped men's football to a few people in the random parks they now had to play in. The FA said the sport was unsuitable for women, claiming it ought not to be encouraged. They underlined their words in 1947 upon banning a ref because he coached a women's team, saying that women's football brings the game into disrepute. Says it all. The Australian FA carried over very similar bans, saying that football was unladylike. You're going to hear that a lot. They also said it was medically inappropriate. Can't kick a football with a vagina, apparently. Women's sport of any kind instantly suffered a loss of press support as a result. The second event were, well, two separate but similar decrees from two technically separate countries. In 1929, Pope Pius XI showed how pious he really was by effectively condemning women who played sports, which put paid to any Catholic or Christian woman who wanted to play, which for the Western world in the 1930s was most of them. His issue was one of decency, particularly the dress of gymnasts, Italy's team having just won silver at the 1928 Olympics. He valued women's virtue, which to him tied to their self-restraint. Read, women who exposed their skin are tempting men. Read, she was asking for it, look what she was wearing. I don't want to get dragged into a rant about this, but basically the whole women are tempting men by dressing provocatively thing implies that the men are incapable of making rational decisions to not, I don't know, pounce and devour women who show their ankles or something like that. It's fucking stupid. This whole attitude shows a complete lack of respect for women and a complete simplistic view of how a man's brain should operate. It shouldn't be me see woman, me take woman. As such, he and his successor shifted the attitudes of the teaching of the church in general against sports, which to them threatened the purity of the soul and of women's delicacy, modesty, their femininity, whatever the fuck that's supposed to mean. As such, any sport in which you were required to, or took advantage from, wearing things like shorts, leggings, bike pants, or God help you, a singlet, was disapproved by the Pope. Whilst Australia was a long way away from the Vatican and had a large Anglican population which was not necessarily governed by the Pope's teachings, over half the country was from religious dominations that were. So, young Doris, let's burn those gym shorts and get you a nice frumpy frock to do the dishes in. Better not show your ankles now, there's a good girl. Incidentally, thanks in no small part to Pope Pius, Italy's next Olympic medal in gymnastics after his decree came 92 years later. With no pope to stop the program after that medal, Italians won 3 more in 2024. Read into that what you will.
Then, stupid white bastard number 1, Benito Mussolini, took the Pope's edicts and just absolutely ran with it. He banned women from any sport that did any more than improve a woman's figure. The fascist-approved suggestions, incidentally, were all sports that women could play in svelte little skirts or swimwear. It was now Italian governmental policy for women to be wives and mothers only. Funny how 90 years later their country's run by a woman. She's still a fascist though, so baby steps. Actually, she doesn't like to be called that, but she absolutely is one, so call her that anytime you can. No clue how she makes any sort of sense, but anyway, back to 1934. The regressive fascist new woman archetype, submissive, childbearing, and delicate, was at odds with fascist policy of displaying the country's strength through sport. Sport, I didn't say joy. Hitler has nothing to do with this.
They're not affiliated with the Nazis at all, not yet at least.
So Mussolini's departments drew up a special list of man-approved sports that women could play to enhance the genetics of their many offspring, to outnumber the foreigners, naturally, without becoming all manly and ugly. They even marketed a new subtype of the fascist new woman, the donna sportivo. Other nations aligned with fascism, and with Italy in particular, adopted this view, and even highly respected medicalists praised Mussolini's edicts. So, the author of this article says, stick to running. Except don't, because women can't run, apparently.
He uses the 1928 Olympics as an example, the 800-metre race specifically, where stories were fabricated that women were fainting on the floor and doing all sorts of, whoosh crikey things that really showed that they couldn't run. This was proved to be a falsehood to try and discredit women's athletic ability. It worked, unfortunately. The next 800-metre race wasn't until 1960, but these were the sort of attitudes that men like this were having around women wanting to take up athletic pursuits, and this further put walls around what women could do, if indeed they were allowed to do it at all. Pope Pius had banned Italian women from the Olympics after all, but forced to relent to allow women to compete to keep up appearances to foreign nations, because of course that's what fascism is all about, the women blew the men out of the damn park. Combined with the great German master race being beaten by a black man, that'd be enough to drive an insecure fascist to war. But we'll get to that. So, the edicts of the Pope and a widespread rejection of the modern woman for modified forms of the old regressive house mother unfortunately combined with the effects of the Great Depression wearing off. So, now men were free to play football and beat their ambulatory child incubators in the comfort that the old ball and chain had to stay in the kitchen again, not allowed to leave, or they'd be run out of town on a fucking rail. Speaking of, let me introduce you to a Pyrrhic figure who really represents how hard women and women's sport had it back then. Meet Jean Flanders. She played in that Kalgoorlie League and was a handy player, even after becoming a mother, which was a point of amusement in local papers. One other who wouldn't be caring for that child was her husband. A cruel man, Flanders was able to get one of under 2,000 successful divorces in the year of 1922, which must have meant she was in a terrible situation because no one was keen to grant a divorce back then. But to avoid her newly minted ex, she had to Jericho Bay herself all the way to Adelaide. The Goldfields League, without her and in the fresh shadow of the FA women's football ban, folded pretty quickly after that. The league that had pioneered football under lights, who had given out what remains the oldest individual prize in the women's code, just stopped. So, women's football took a nosedive with next to no recorded games after 1934. It would have to take something big for women to get back on the footy field. As it turned out, a painter turned dictator was preparing to, completely inadvertently, usher in a new wave of feminism with just a single invasion of Poland. Stupid white bastard number 2, Adolf Dip Hitler, cemented his status as an unlikely feminist icon by necessitating, once again, the en masse recruitment of women, but this time in factories, warehouses, and the military itself. The Australian Army were forced through lack of manpower to establish many women-only military branches with 50,000 women serving. And although the Melbourne clubs continued through the war, many around Australia's top leagues didn't. Again, this left the door open for women to come on through. Northern Tasmania opened their arms to women's footy, with local radio stations hosting a fundraiser for the war effort that was so successful, one team decided to travel the state. They did well, until attempting to go down to Hobart, where the menfolk put a stop to these silly women trying to play a men's game. Yeah, because that was the most important thing to worry about in the 1940s, almost like women's sports has been a happy hunting ground for conservative strawmen since time immemorial. The main way that women were able to justify getting a fair go with the Sherrin was again through fundraising for the war effort. One notable game was dubbed the Funds for Fags event, which, yeah, sounds pretty bad, but don't worry, this wasn't about marginalising the gay community, at least not yet. This was about giving our brave young boys in battle the chance to contract lung cancer instead of, or in some cases, in addition to, war-induced trauma.
Some fundraisers even transcended gender boundaries. Here, on the former grounds of Actil Oval in St Clair, Adelaide, the first recorded game between a team of men and a team of women was played, or at least the first such match to be taken seriously by both sides. Another such match would be held in Iron Knob in 1950, no laughing at the back, and in Grange in South Australia in 1953 as hospital fundraisers, neither of which gave into the frivolity of costume football. The same couldn't be said for a game in Harvey, WA in 1947, where men dressed as women became the second recorded men's team to lose to women, this time dressed as men, 9-0.
In 1945, Adolf further explored accidental equality measures and decided to have an equal opportunity gun barrel tasting session that ended the war. Women had seen what happened before. Despite women's football being the main draw in some areas during the war, with some games raising over £100 for the war effort, the men wanted to come home and resume their roles as the sports stars, the breadwinners, the providers, whilst the women went back to being seen and not heard, especially if they were being seen in the kitchen, Mavis. Me and the lads are watching the game and need some more sandwiches. For the footballing woman, or indeed any modern woman for that matter, war was her best friend, as it freed up room for her to undertake any pursuits that she really wanted outside the house, filling the space of active servicemen. After World War I, they'd been forced to accept returning to their second-class gender status. No, not this time. Not after gaining greater independence in this war than the last. Now, the war for equality would spill out into peacetime. Women would now have to publicly fight politicians, members of the clergy, and even top-level footballers just for the right to kick like a girl.